Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. And on the anniversary of Austerlitz, we return to our what wasn't intended to be our Odyssey on Austerlitz, but ended up being our Odyssey on Austerlitz. Alex Mikaberidze returns for this one to talk us through the day, possibly Napoleon's greatest day, but maybe we'll get to assessing that in due course. If you don't know already, Alex is one of the great scholars of the current generation of the Napoleonic Wars. If I say much more, he will reach through the computer screen and throttle me. But people go and buy, he actually nods in response to that. But people go and buy the Napoleonic Wars, A Global History. It is one of the standout volumes of the last decade on this period. And also Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace. Alex, great to see you again. How are things with you?
Thank you, my friend. I'm delighted to be back. I guess I'm doing something right since you have generously allowed me to finish this episode.
Yeah, well, we were really going to just kind of shun you away
I was
because,
worried because because I spoke maybe a little bit too long last time.
see, passion and enthusiasm cannot be contained. We've literally made a podcast out of the fact that we don't shut up and cannot contain our enthusiasm. So if somebody else brings that energy, we're not going to turn around and go, actually, no, I don't think we'll have sort of the leading and extremely passionate scholar of the Napoleonic era back on our podcast to talk about probably the most famous battle of the period after Waterloo.
I assume you're saying you have a Napoleonic-sized enthusiasm. Is that what you're saying?
This is the trouble when you have intelligent guests on the show. They start to turn your words against you. So we are going to very rapidly move on before any further comparisons between me and Napoleon strike devastatingly close to home. Dawn, 2nd of December, 1805, Austerlitz Day. We've talked about the build up to Austerlitz. Folks need to go back to last week's episode and listen to the episode that we entitled The Eve of Austerlitz for all of the context, all of the macho bravado, Napoleon playing the Russians. All of that is contained in our effective prequel episode. But on Austerlitz Day, the Allies, they're going to strike Napoleon's right flank. Talk us through their thought process behind this attack around the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. And what are the soldiers of both sides experiencing during this early phase of the battle, particularly in terms of things like weather, the time of year? We don't generally associate December with the time to go campaigning.
That's right. And just to situate the listener maybe in better, imagine standing on top of a rolling hill up in the Czechian kind of Bohemian, in technically Moravian countryside on that cold, overcast morning of December 2nd. And I think it will be better if we actually start on the Allied side because they are making the first move. And if you are with the soldiers, then there is a cold, there is uncertainty to a large degree of what to expect. The officers are telling you that the battle will take place in the next hour or so. But I think for many soldiers, the uncertainty on the faces of the officers would have been quite visible. And we certainly have good evidence to discuss that. I know we know that, for example, Kutuzov, who is, of course, nominally the commander-in-chief of the entire coalition army, but in reality has been sidelined, as we have seen. We know that he barely slept that night. Right? He dozed here and there, but spent most of the night dealing with the administrative side of having this army prepared for the battle. And he, for example, described that at around 7 o'clock in the morning, the soldiers began to leave the positions. And what he means here is that the main strike of the coalition force was on the left flank. And here, three massive columns of General Dokhturov, Langeron, and Przemyślewski, totaling about 25,000 men, were supposed to slowly descend from the Pratzen height engage the enemy around Telnitz and Sokolnitz, and then roll the enemy flank, which will allow the rest of the coalition army then to strike in the middle. And so when the soldiers of Doktorov and Langeron began to move down, immediately there was a problem. And the problem was that when these first two columns began to move, some of the soldiers, some of the columns that were expected to be coming with them were nowhere to be seen. In fact, we know that Langeron's column, for example, had in fact been interrupted by the unexpected arrival of another column. And in this case, it's actually an Austrian column of Prince Liechtenstein. And so already here in the beginning, in the early moves of the battle, the Allies are bungling it. Their actions are quite confusing. So what happened? Well, when Weyrother, whom we met in the last episode, issued the disposition, and disposition was copied in multiple copies, and then, as you recall, read out instead of kind of given to the commanding officers. Well, the movements, despite Weyrother's efforts, the movements actually of columns oftentimes intersected with each other. So in this particular case, Liechtenstein's fifth column actually came across Langeron's column, and so they had to figure out who will go first. And of course, that takes time. And so just as the flanking movement, which was in any battle based on this factor of time and speed, the Allies actually are losing it. On top of it, the fourth column of the Allies, commanded nominally by Austrian commander Johann Karl Kolovrath, but accompanied by Kutuzov, who effectively exercised command of it, was also supposed to move, but Kutuzov actually tells Kolovrath to ignore the disposition and hold his ground on top of the Pratzen heights. So if we were hovering above the battlefield over the first kind of 30, even 40 minutes, then we would have seen some of these allies moving as prescribed, and most of them actually standing and trying to figure out what to happen. Well, after almost an hour delay, Langeron and Przebrzewski were finally able to resume their march, and they kind of picked up the speed in order to get to Doktorov, who's been already engaging the French on the banks of the Goldbach stream. And so what this meant was that instead of this math of over 25,000 men coming almost all at once against Davout's corps, which, as we have seen in the previous days, in the last episode, had spent previous 48 hours marching over 70 miles and been exhausted, tired, hungry. So instead of dealing with this might of the left flank all at once, Davout had to fight in a staggered defense, with first dealing with Doktorov, then dealing with Langeron, then dealing with Przebrzewski. And so that allowed the French to effectively, and Davout, we can't lose, we have to, I think, acknowledge that there was a superb commander, and just a year later will demonstrate that ability at Austerlitz. So Davout was able to organize an effective defense, which allowed him to utilize a fewer number of men, but to keep up and protect the right flank of the French army. So any hope that the Allies had of gaining a quick breakthrough and rolling the enemy flank dissipates by 8:30 of that morning. So it becomes clear that the battle is not going the way they intended to. Well, as the last of the Przebrzewski's men climbed down Pratzen height, the fourth column, as I said, Kolovrath column with Kutuzov attached to it, continues to stand on top of it. So it's not following the prescribed disposition. Now, the Kolovrath division, column, was a combined column. It's a mixed column of Austrian troops, in fact, made up of new and inexperienced recruits, which is an important factor in any battle, and far more experienced and seasoned Russian troops, commanded by one of my favorite figures of Napoleonic Wars, a very flamboyant figure, oftentimes referred to as the Russian version of Murat, General Mikhail Miloradovich. So, and so they're standing on top of these heights, and suddenly Emperor Alexander and his glittering entourage of young officers arrived. They intended to kind of observe the glorious victory. And then quickly they kind of cast a cursing glance and a look at the battlefield and realize something is not going right. And especially they notice this group of soldiers standing there. And so Alexander spurs his horse. He gets closer to Kutuzov, whom he identifies with those troops. And there is a wonderful conversation between the two of them where Alexander says, "Why you're not moving forward? Like we agreed upon." And Kutuzov, being a very kind of skilled courtier and kind of very seasoned diplomat, tries to prevaricates and kind of says, Your Majesty, I'm waiting for all the troops to assemble. Right? He knows better than that, but he kind of tries to give him a vague answer. And Alex is not having it, and he says, "But what? What are you waiting for? We are not at the Empress's Meadow," and that's near the Russian imperial capital, where one waits for arrival of all the troops to begin the parade. And that's when Kutuzov responds, "Precisely, Your Majesty. It is because we are not on the parade ground that I'm not commencing the movement." And what he essentially tells Alexander is that I've been telling you this battle is a mistake. I'm telling you we're moving into towards the defeat, and I'm trying to gain time, young man. I'm trying to figure out what Napoleon's countermove will be. And as we have seen in previous episode, Kutuzov expects that countermove on Napoleon's part will involve an attack in the center. And so he stands there. And Alex I imagine this kind of confrontation between these young emperors surrounded by these young men and the older, more seasoned men around Kutuzov. And finally, Alex, failing to grasp the importance of holding on the Pratzen height, failing to grasp the importance of time, gives Kutuzov's direct order to move the fourth column from the Pratzen heights down towards villages of Kobelnitz and Butovitz. And so Kutuzov complies. Now, one of the fascinating scenes, and again, the more closer to the ground scene. Well, one of the generals who is not up there with Alexander, not even with Kutuzov, but he's commanding a Russian regiment. But he's of German origin, and he writes wonderful memoirs. So he actually witnesses this exchange between Alex and Kutuzov, and he's kind of stunned by it, right? And even more so, he's stunned when Kutuzov, as the emperor turns around and rides away, Kutuzov loudly mutters in German. He says, "Brilliant! He wants me to command, and yet it wasn't me who ordered the attack. It wasn't me who planned the battle. In fact, I don't want to fight this battle at all." And so Berg, in his memoirs, he says, "I had a, quote, very bad premonition of what's about to happen."
Yeah, a moment like that doesn't exactly instill you with confidence. If Kutuzov had been wearing a hat, I imagine he might have sort of thrown it down on the floor in disgust.
And stomped on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
well, I think Berg would have been having an even worse premonition if he had known what was happening across just a mile away from him across the battlefield, because there, covered in this famous, almost legendary fog of the morning of December 2nd, stood, of course, the French army. And Napoleon waited. So all these times, while allies are bungling the movements, while they're engaging Davout, while there's this growing pressure on the French right flank, Napoleon waits. He knows that the fog is kind of concealing the view from the Pratzen height, but not enough for him not to distinguish these dark shadows descending from the plateau, just as he anticipated, just as he predicted in the day before. He, most crucially, for men of his military knowledge and experience, it wouldn't have been difficult to notice the lack of coordination, the lack of consistency in the movements of the Allies. He would have clearly, I think, identified the fact that the three columns of the left of the Allied left flank were moving disjointedly, and that there were intervals opening between them. And in fact, later, even if we give him the benefit of hindsight, later, and I'm saying just days after the battle, he said that the enemy behaved and this is a quote, the enemy behaved with an amount of ignorance and presumption difficult to conceive. Right? So even he is astounded that the Allies are playing along with him. So around by 9 o'clock, Napoleon is receiving steady reports that Davout's corps, even though hard pressed, is holding his position at Telnitz and Sokolnitz, which means that Napoleon doesn't have to worry as much about his flank. So he famously turns around to General, future Marshal, already Marshal, I think, Soult, right? No, he's going to be Marshal. Yeah, he's General yet. Who is commanding the Fourth Corps, and he poses that famous question that has been long debated among the military historians, where he asks Soult how long it will take you to scale those heights that they would have been able to see appearing through the mist. And Soult, I think, with a natural bravado of any officer asked by a supervisor, by a commanding general, he says, about 15 minutes, sir. Right? So,
it's just a quiet stroll, really. You know,
exactly.
Those Russians or those Austrians or whoever's at the top of those heights, you know, we can't quite tell. You know, they're not going to bother us. You know, they're like rabbits. They'll just scarper. You know, we'll just go for a leisurely walk.
So whether he said 15, 20, or 25, I'm sure that Soult wanted to kind of show the emperor that he can do it, that it's not going to be that challenging, or well, at least he would overplay kind of this factor. And so Napoleon, I think Napoleon would have appreciated that kind of sentiment. So he tells Soult, all right, not yet, right? Contain your enthusiasm. And so he waited a bit more, and then around 9 o'clock, he gives Soult 2 divisions in order to proceed with a plan of assaulting the Pratzen plateau, which by now seemed sufficiently bare of enemy presence. And so in this remarkable moment, when left flank of the Allied army has already cleared the Pratzen heights and is fighting in the lowlands near the Golbach stream, where the fourth column is of Kolovrat is slowly descending from the Pratzen heights. The fog that previously obscured the enemy positions now suddenly dissipates, almost like magic, right? And the French divisions burst out into the open, taking the Allies by surprise. Kutuzov, we know that he immediately realized that his warnings of what will happen is actually happening. He later told Alexander that he could see the enemy's intention was to seize the summit of the heights and to cut off our line of retreat, and he understood that this was the core, right? This was the core struggle. Whoever prevailed here would be the winner. So he immediately orders the fourth column to stop descending and kind of try to contain the enemy advance. And so you have now on the slopes of the Pratzen height this furious battle between the French, Austrians, and the Russians. Now, if you listen to the Russian side, they argued that the Austrians failed to contain the initial kind of momentum of the enemy. And I think from the Austrian side, a lot of blame is assigned to the Russians and how they managed it. But frankly, I think both sides shared a degree of responsibility for it. And so it certainly didn't help, as I pointed out, that the Austrian troops were inexperienced troops. They were recent recruits, so they would have had very difficult time containing the veterans of the Sult's corps. I think one of the eyewitnesses actually describes, and there's a wonderful quote, that there was a confusion, questionable arrangements and movements, and precious minutes passed while disorder grew. And this is from on the Russian side. So every battle, of course, is that full of confusion and quote unquote fog of war. But Austerlitz is literally full of confusion and fog of war. General Miloradovich felt that the enemy appeared out of nowhere, and more crucially, what he felt was that the enemy's strength steadily grew with almost every passing minute. And he describes the French deployed in the chess formation, increasing fire intensity and launching new attacks, seeking to turn our flanks. And so the units that Miloradovich had are effectively driven back and are forced to climb up in the slopes of Pratzen in an attempt to maybe hold the position on top. They are unable. Sult's men are moving very quickly in their pursuit, but within 35-40 minutes, the Kolovrat's fourth column is disintegrating, and we see this very clearly through the reports submitted by the Russian officers, who all spoke at the remarkable efficiency of the French advance. So Kutuzov tries to kind of shore up the center by bringing troops from the nearby columns, and he sends even his aide-de-camps to the Grand Duke Constantine, who was in charge of the Russian Imperial Guard, and was standing on the other side of the slope. So he understands that here, the next 30-40 minutes is crucial to the battle. And indeed, whoever would have shored up the position would have come out on top in this battle. And we see here in the struggle on Pratzen Plateau a fierce determination on both sides to prevail. Battalion to battalion, man to man. I would say both sides would have been quite matched, and the grim determination of the Russian soldiers, which they were notorious or famous, if you want to use that, throughout the Napoleonic Wars, was matched by the fervent intensity of the French. That the elan, the mythical elan that the French troops supposedly possessed. But in addition to elan, of course, what the French have, and what Napoleon was careful to have, is to have a numerical superiority at this particular point on the battlefield. Napoleon commits additional forces to support Soult's division, and by 10 o'clock, Kutuzov's men are driven from the Pratzen Heights.
So there are moments, very rare moments, where I feel like a spectator on this show. That was one of them, because you just blasted through effectively the entirety of the most famous aspect of the battle. Right there, we're about to get to the second one, and then we'll get onto the mythologies in just a moment, because I'm sure there's a very delicious rant to be had there. But you're painting a really interesting picture here, Alex, because actually it's not a foregone conclusion. That's something that's coming through quite clearly in this, that yes, the Allies have managed to get almost everything wrong. And as you say, that is quite remarkable, that almost if you could wargame a worst case scenario of how to absolutely lose a battle, that opening phase by the Allies is absolutely textbook in terms of all the things that you don't do. But it's not over yet. You're talking about Grand Duke Constantine. We've got the Guard cavalry still to come into play. How knife-edged do you think this really is? Because the French clearly have the momentum. Napoleon clearly has the advantage of surprise. The balance of morale has to be shifting in the way of the French, because everybody on both sides can see quite what's going on here. The French can see they're on the offensive. They can see that they are gaining ground. Equally, the Austrians and the Russians can see that their plan of attack went up in smoke almost from the beginning. Now they're having to fight for this key position. Where is the seesaw kind of balance of morale at this point in battle? And also just kind of talk us through the fighting that will follow, and how Napoleon will respond to this counterstrike.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right, and I think that's the element where we oftentimes maybe lose track of, and because we are still under the awe of Napoleon's stunning victory, right? We kind of try to oftentimes think that Napoleon had every move predetermined, every move expected. But I think the fighting on the Pratzen Height is one of those situations where, had the Allies done certain things differently, the battle might have turned out quite. The outcome of the battle would have been quite different. And I think one of them was, of course, holding at least with a fourth column the position on top of the heights. Second would have been to actually provide to move the reinforcements more efficiently to support this column once the battle began. But that again goes back to this issue of the disposition of the Allied army being so bungled by Weyrother and the officers that helped him, that it was challenging but not impossible to do that. And the arrival of the Russian Imperial Guard is a good example of it. So as I pointed out, Kutuzov actually sends a message to Grand Duke Constantine to come as fast as possible to help the center of the enemy, the Allied force. The Russian Imperial Guard is a superb force. It has elite units, Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, Izmailovsky regiments. It has Life Guard Jaeger battalion, and of course it has, most crucially, the artillery or the cavalry, most famously the Chevalier Guards, and the artillery that collectively would have made the Imperial Guard a strong enough force of about 10,000 men with about 40 cannon that could have played a crucial role here. But what happened is this: when the battle began, the Imperial Guard actually welcomed the sunrise several kilometers, or kind of a couple of miles from the Pratzen Heights, almost at the village of Austerlitz, right in the back. Now, the Allied battle plan called for the guard to slowly get to the Pratzen Height and then support Liechtenstein's fifth column, which was primarily made up of the cavalry, about 7,000 horsemen, that were expected. This cavalry was expected to be this kind of bridging the gap between the center and Bagration's right flank up in the north. And of course, it certainly helps that that gap that is appearing as the Allied troops are clearing the Pratzen Height has a rolling nature to it. So the slopes of the Pratzen Heights slowly go down into the valley, and it's a place where cavalry can easily operate. And so the idea was that Liechtenstein's 7,000 men will be more than enough to hold this gap, and then, if need be, behind them will be the Russian Imperial Guard. And so Constantine kind of acts upon it. Now, one of the fundamental flaws, and this is where, again, we go back to this such a poor conception from a management point of view. So if we look at the coalition army, the left flank, which comprises of three columns, is actually placed under overall command of a single man, General Friedrich Wilhelm Buxhoffen. So left flank has its own commander. But then the rest of the army, right? The rest of the army doesn't have the overall commander. Right? So you have column commanders, including Kutuzov, who is attached to the fourth column, but the rest of them are kind of operating separate. And so what it meant was that these columns operating on their own. Now, the presumption in the Allied headquarters, why Weyrother kind of came up with this kind of approach, was that these columns would have been close to the Allied headquarters, and they could be directly coordinated by the Tsar and his cadre. But as it was, when the battle began and when this counter-strike by the French shatters the Allied complacency, and literally Emperor Alexander disappears in the middle of the battle, and his officers are all scattered, and Kutuzov is only attached to the fourth column, the reality is that these columns, right, the fourth, the fifth, the Imperial Guard, Bagrations, they're all operating on their own disjointedly. And so this is where I think the Cecil battle that you're alluding to could have been, I think, handled battle differently if you had a more coordinated, right, shall we say, kind of general staff kind of level of control, command and control on the Allied side. Now, Grand Duke Constantine, what can we say about him? As a brother of the emperor, born with a giant silver spoon, Constantine is a man whose ambition and ego far outstrips his abilities and his talents, and that's something that we'll see many, many times throughout the Napoleonic Wars. He didn't act with sufficient alacrity, right, on that morning. He didn't act with sufficient speed when he received the orders from Kutuzov. And so by the time he gets to the Pratzen Heights, he already sees actually these opaque masses of troops streaming down the Pratzen Heights. And this is, of course, the Russian and Austrian troops who are fleeing. And so he tries to then do what he thinks will be a useful thing. Go around the top of the Pratzen Heights, go around it on the right side, and strike at the enemy as they're approaching the Pratzen. And the appearance of the Russian Imperial Guard initially is actually delivers some results. So it certainly blunts the French attack. The French in this case are from First Division, commanded by General Caffarelli, a very capable man. But already there, we see the problem emerging where when the Russians try to attack a nearby village of Blasowitz, they were unable to take it despite having a vast numerical superiority. So the French actually were able to hold the village very efficiently with fewer number of men. So Constantine then orders his entire column then to move forward. So that's cavalry and infantry. And then he sends his cavalry charging at the advancing French forces, conveniently also ordering the guard infantry to follow up. Well, the problem is that the slopes on this side of the Pratzen Heights, the slopes where the guard infantry was supposed to advance, had a lot of vineyards, had a lot of kind of fencing, which allowed the French to hold their position better than the advancing Russian troops. And so we see then between 9, 10, 10:30 in the morning, this kind of confused, jumbled fighting on the slopes of what was known as a Stare Vinohrady, between the Russian and the French infantry, Russian and French cavalry. And it's really confusing sets of back and forth actions. Napoleon steadily feeds his attack. For example, he orders Vandame's troops to kind of move forward. They were supported by the rest of the Bernadotte kind of first corps. So now we talk about two corps, Soult's fourth and Bernadotte's first corps, committed to the fighting. And at one moment, Constantine actually tries to use his cavalry to stop the advance of the French infantry. He sends his units to engage them, and that creates this remarkable scene where the 4th Regiment of Line, the French 4th Regiment of Line, was surrounded by the Russian Imperial Guard, the cavalrymen, especially from the Life Guard Horse and Hussar regiments, and cut up, really badly mauled. And so the scenes of this 1st Battalion of the 4th Line disintegrating, being surrounded by the cavalry, they're slashing and cutting, a desperate fight. The battalion begins to flee, and during this struggle, 4 Russian kind of privates, we actually know their names, Privates Gavrilov, Ushakov, Glazunov, and Omelchenko, see a flag with an eagle on top. And so they think this is it, right? It's going to be the symbol of French military kind of might. So they slash their way towards it, seize what is actually a battalion eagle, and then carry it triumphantly to the Grand Duke, which will be the only trophy taken by the Allies during this entire battle.
I love that moment of, look, we've won, we've captured an eagle. You know, if this was sort of a sharp novel, then yes, you know, at this point the credits would roll because the entire French army would just run away. However, military history don't work quite like novels. Surprise, surprise, folks. We focused a lot on the center and the southern fighting, but I do just want to bring what's happening in the north into all of this, because the numbers there aren't insignificant. A very quick glance at a battle map will tell folks, you know, you've got Lannes in the north. I mean, that says a lot. You've got somebody like Lannes holding the northern flank. But you've also got Bagration sort of over in the sort of north kind of eastern kind of section of that battlefield. So talk me through what's actually happening here. How much is sort of Napoleon kind of biding his time, waiting? How much of him is just kind of leaving Lannes there as sort of a lingering threat? And how does Lannes respond to this situation? Because Lannes is a guy who likes to get stuck in. So talk me through all of this.
Yes. So Bagration's force, which comprised the entirety of the Allied right flank, was advancing on the road from Rausnitz towards Brno, towards Brunn. And so it started that morning with these instructions to proceed along the main road, engage the enemy force, but this was not even the secondary line of attack of the Allied coalition, but rather it was a pivot in many ways, a pivot on which the rest of the army will turn. So Bagration had the instructions to move forward, but the instructions were quite simple. And of course, knowing Bagration and having written his biography, and I find it quite interesting that you have 2 men of a similar type, similar outlook on fighting. Lannes and Bagration matched here. Both of them are, I always imagine them like one of those Spanish war studs, right? The war stallions who are biting at the bridle, trying to unleash the fury, and yet they have a specific tasks assigned to them, right? And they can't act on it. So they're quite frustrated. We know that. We know from the correspondence of Bagration, and we know certainly from the Lannes' point of view that they want a more free-flowing battle where they have the capacity to conduct themselves. And especially, remember, in the last episode, we know that when Bagration looked at the disposition, right, he actually tells his Austrian colleagues, we're going to lose this damn battle. So I think already in that sense, Bagration is a disadvantage. On the Lannes side, his instructions are also to wage a more passive, I would say, battle. Because for Napoleon, Lannes is not necessarily a pivot, but he's a crucial element of the battle because he needs to actually keep the Allied pivot from performing its role. And so the two sides then engaged between, kind of for the listeners to imagine it, on the northern section of the battlefield, can be divided into this kind of open rolling plains between the Santon Hill, which is on the French side, and Rausnitz, which is on the Allied side. And in between them, there is a small settlement of Possorids. And so most of the fighting then is taking place between the Allies and the French, between Napoleon, Lannes and Bagration, right in front of Possorids. And it's I would say, slow engagement because both sides are feeling themselves out. Bagration will try to launch a couple of attacks. He claims that he gained some ground. Lannes, on the other hand, if you read his reports, argued that he came up on top. But for the rest of the day, I think it's a back and forth action between these two very, very capable commanders who actually met a few days before the battle. Almost 2 weeks before the battle, at the Battle of Schongrab and Hollabrunn. And you know what's the fascinating thing? In that battle, before the battle commenced, there was an armistice, the famous ruse that the Russians kind of hosted on Murat. And as they were meeting, and I always imagine them kind of sipping a wine, right, and looking at each other and kind of measuring each other up. Lannes and Bagration had this chat in which Lannes tells him, if I were in command, we would not be sipping wine, we would be killing each other. And Bagration, I imagine, kind of taking a sip, looks at him and says, "Oh yeah, I know that." I mean, there is a certain respect of each other's ability here, and it is only in the second half of the battle, on the second half of the day, when it becomes clear that decisive developments in the center have given French an advantage, that Bagration will be forced to have an orderly retreat, and Lannes will also kind of slowly and methodically pursue him. But by the end, Bagration's right flank is the only part of the Allied army that still retains its battle formation that it had before the battle.
Okay, so that's what's happening in the northern part of the field. Lannes being very measured, it seems. But let's talk about the breakthrough moment. What is it that ultimately turns the tide emphatically in Napoleon's favor, as opposed to this situation that we've had in the center, where sort of it's flowing, it's coming backwards and forwards, and the French have the momentum, but there isn't that emphatic sense that yes, everything is broken, the French are shattered, and the day is Napoleon's.
I think. And this is where we need to step back a little to the point that you made that I think in popular imagination, once Napoleon tells Soult to climb the Pratzen heights, this is it. But if we assume that order was given between 8:45 and 9 o'clock, it's not enough until another 2 hours later that we actually see that breakthrough. So we still have this 2 hours of tenacious, bloody fighting. For me, the decisive point is actually the defeat of the Russian Imperial Guard. When Grand Duke Constantine brought the guard from the back and kind of swooped around the heights and tried to engage the French infantry, and when they started cutting up the battalion of the first line, Napoleon actually saw this. In more than this, some of the troops that were retreating, some of the French troops that were retreating, actually passed by Napoleon. And there is a wonderful quote from one of the eyewitnesses who says the quote, "The unfortunate fellows were distracted with fear and would listen to no one. And in reply to our reproaches, they kept shouting, 'Vive l'Empereur!' while fleeing faster than ever." And I love that part. I imagine them waving their hands like, "Hey, Napoleon, good, but we're gonna be in the bag." And so Napoleon recognizes the danger that if the Russian Imperial Guard builds on this momentum and kind of keeps rolling, that his plan will be negated. And so he turns to Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bessieres, who is commander of the French Imperial Guard. He tells him to intervene. And Bessieres, being a superb officer with plenty of experience, steadily feeds the guard. So unlike Constantine, who kind of brings all 10,000 men, and kind of, there's a jumbled commitment here and there, Bessier first sends 2 squadrons of chasseurs cheval under Colonel Francois Morland, then feeds in the squadron of Mamluks, who were on the temporary command of General Jean Rapp, one of the really, really fascinating figures of Napoleonic Wars. And Rapp, being a Frenchman who is leading this group of Mamluks who come from all over the world, and I've written a study of them, and actually looking just at the Mamluks, you truly realize the international dimension of Napoleonic Wars that is taking place in this one particular part of Europe and on the small field in Moravia, because the Mamluks, they actually, if you look at the rosters, they come from Georgia. The commanding officer, actually, of the squadron is from my hometown. They come from Georgia, Circassia, Armenia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Hungary, Greece, Albania, Malta, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and my favorite, 2 guys from Darfur in what is today Sudan. Right? It's incredible to imagine the stories, individual stories of these men who actually converge now and become part of the larger imperial competition in Europe. Just imagine being those 2 guys, Ali and Rizqala, who were born in Darfur, in a small village in present-day Sudan, were kidnapped, sold into slavery, joined the French when they came to Egypt. Right? We can speculate on the reasons for it. Right? Is it a promise of emancipation? Is the promise of money, or is this genuine belief in the French ideals? Right? And now these 2 guys are thousands of miles away from their homeland, fighting in the heart of the Austrian Empire. One of my favorite guys, actually, if the listener wants, they can look at this remarkable painting, probably the most iconic painting of Napoleonic Wars, Gerard's The Battle of Austerlitz, right? Massive canvas that Napoleon is kind of stands iconic on it. But to the left corner of it, right? If you look to the left of Napoleon, you will actually see several Mamluks, and one of them is Mustafa Bakdouin from Baghdad, who actually Mustafa actually captured the Russian flag, delivered it to Napoleon, and then kind of casually mentioned that, oh, by the way, I'm going back to fight, and I'm going to try to bring you the Grand Duke Constantine's head. And Napoleon is so taken by this promise that he it earns Mustafa a harsh rebuke of being a ghastly savage, right? Kind of a very Orientalist point here. In any case, so these Mamluks, these chasseurs à cheval, are striking back at the Russian Imperial Guard cavalry. They will be slowly supported by the rest of the French Imperial Guard's cavalry, and over the next, I would say, 35 to 40 minutes, that is the crucial element of the battle. Which side will break? Which of the elite force will come on top? The Russian Imperial Guard, the cavalry supported by the infantry, or is it the Imperial Guard supported by, for example, Bernadotte's First Corps? Jean-Baptiste Drouet's division would be moved up to support the cavalry. And so about 30-40 minutes in, I would say the scales are even. Right? You'll see Russians plunging into this melee, then swirling, coming out, then the French will sue them, and the fighting is seesaw until the arrival of the squadrons of those legendary grosses bottes, the great boots, or the grenadiers à cheval. Right? I always kind of have this imagery of this tall man, immaculately kind of equipped with these great red plumes tossing around as they trotted towards the enemy. And once they arrive, right? This heavy cavalry sweeps across the field. The Russians, who are scattered around, fail to regroup in time. They're overwhelmed and they're forced to retreat back. And once the Russian Imperial Guard begins to leave the battlefield, I see no point at which the Allies can turn this battle around. And Napoleon immediately understands this, because as soon as he saw the Russian guards fleeing, he turned and to his officers and said, "Now it only remains to reap the reward of our plans."
And we all know what happens next, because we've all seen the Ridley Scott film. Napoleon shouts at some people 5 miles away, tells them to, unmask the guns. They all aim at some ice, and the entire Austrian and Russian army drowns. Except that they really don't. No, I wasn't there, but don't stop with that. Even I'm bored of that joke now. But what does interest me about this is that at the time, everybody knows that's not the case. Those ponds, and that's all they are, they're fishing ponds, are drained within a matter of, I believe, a few weeks of the battle. And they find, I forget the precise numbers, but it's something like a horse and a couple of guys. It's that level of insignificance in terms of what actually happens in this sort of aspect of the retreat and the perception. So what really interests me is where that perception comes from, where that myth kind of crystallizes and explodes from, and who's responsible for its perpetuation.
Napoleon. The answer is clearly Napoleon. And of course, the myth begins with a bulletin that Napoleon issues in the wake of the battle. And for listeners, I'm sure they're familiar with Napoleon's, I would say, pioneering approach. There were early instances where the commanders tried to communicate with their troops, kind of trying to level with their troops. And Russian Generalissimo Alexander Suvorov is a good example of it, where he understood the importance of having, quote unquote, kind of conversation with the soldiers and explaining what's happening. But of course, in a specific way, so that the morale is boosted and the soldier is willing to fight. But Napoleon really perfects that system through his bulletins, which he already experiments with in 1796. And after each battle, after each march or at certain intervals, Napoleon would issue these documents that will tell the soldiers, okay, here's what happened, here's who we fought, here's what we're going to do. But of course, this is all couched in this propagandistic kind of cocoon. And the bulletin that is issued after the Austerlitz is a good example of it, because in that bulletin, Napoleon talks about the ice on the ponds being smashed by the French artillery and the Allied soldiers being falling into the pond and drowning, right? And so that imagery, dramatic imagery, right? When you imagine the cold winter day up in this Moravian countryside, frozen pond, your men, right, your artillery smashing the ice and the enemy falling through and drowning, I mean, it was irresistible. And so even though we know that in the days forward, as you pointed out, Napoleon actually ordered the draining of the ponds, and he knew better. He knew what was found there. He still stuck by the dramatic imagery because he understood the value of it.
Do you think he had any? This is very sort of off topic and rabbit holey, but I'm just curious about the mindset of Napoleon in that moment of victory here. Do you think he had any premonition that actually that would go on to become a key part of the storytelling of this battle, or doesn't he actually care about that in the immediate wake of the victory?
I think so, Zach, because Napoleon is if there is one way to describe him, is very calculated. He's very deliberate in what he does, and especially when it comes to bulletins. Bulletins is not like an email where you can kind of quickly type and click it and it's gone, and then you realize, oh, I should have added this. Bulletins were carefully crafted, and if you indulge me, let me read this passage, because I think the listener will get immediately the deliberate part of it. So this is the opening paragraph of it. Soldiers, I'm pleased with you. On the day of Austerlitz, you lived up to all of my expectations of your bravery and boldness. You have decked your eagle with a glory that shall never die. In less than 4 hours, an army of 100,000 men, we know that's not true, commanded by the emperors of Russia and Austria, has been cut to pieces and dispersed. Those who escaped your steel drowned in the lakes. 40 standards, the standards of the Russian Imperial Guard, 120 cannon, 20 generals, more than 30,000 prisoners. We know that's not true. These are the results of this day of eternal renown. So absolutely, right? He knows the picture that he wants to implant in your head. And that's the picture of French triumphantly storming across the plains, climbing the Pratzen heights, driving the enemy into the ponds and drowning them. And it's you gotta admire the skill here.
It's a fascinating mentality. You know, the realities of Austerlitz aren't enough. I'm going to go and inflate them even further. There's a whole psychological study to be done about the way in which propaganda is utilized and what that says about perceptions of what's enough in terms of victory. But that's a whole thing for another day. Two things before we end, and the first of those is quite simply legacies. What is the aftermath of Austerlitz?
Austerlitz is. There are so many ways we can grapple with that question. Really, we can grapple on an individual level. We can look at the kind of on the army level, and then maybe on on a nation and an imperial level. On the individual level, I think Austerlitz is the battle that made and broke so many careers. And on the French side, of course, every officer was kind of proud of the fact that they were there, that they were involved in this battle. And again, it brings me to this bulletin that I cited, because at the end of that bulletin, Napoleon has this wonderful passage where he says, soldiers, and when he says soldiers, he aims at the public, right? He said, when everything required for happiness and prosperity of our fatherland has been accomplished, I shall bring you back home. There you will be object of my tenderest attentions. My people will welcome you back with delight, and all you will have to say is, I was at Austerlitz, for them to reply, there goes a brave man. And I like that imagery because we know that many of those officers, many of those soldiers who survived the battle went on to have successful careers, right? In the next few years. On the other side, on the Allied side, this is the battle that unmade careers, right? This is where in the next year, I would say 2-3 years, a lot of the officers who were present here were actually sent in kind of disgrace and into exile, starting with Kutuzov himself. Kutuzov is removed from command, blamed for the entirety of the disaster, and then sent to a backwater to be a governor, and then given the task of commanding a second-rate kind of theater and down in the Danubian provinces, right? So this is part of it. In fact, one of the fascinating things is that there is a lot of soul searching on the Russian side of who performed well at this battle, who didn't. And there were plenty of them. And so in the days after the battle, actually, Kutuzov himself, he conducts investigation on what happened in the battle, and personally cashiers, removes officers from their command. In fact, in case of one general, he's actually court-martialed, right, for being for mismanaging his. So there is a lot of negative, more detrimental stuff for Austerlitz in terms of a legacy on the individual level. On the army level, once again, this is the battle that really creates the image of Grande Armée as the superb killing machine. The way Napoleon utilized this army, despite all the problems that it had, right? We know logistically the French were not anywhere near where Napoleon kind of portrays them. We know that they had issues of discipline. We know that even Davout's legendary call, when it arrives from Vienna, it arrives barely a third of the men that Davout had, right? Despite all, everything is ignored because of Austerlitz. And instead, now you have the vision of the Grande Armée that the way we now imagine it, right? The popular in popular perception of Napoleon's army, that image is created by Austerlitz. This is an army that loses barely 9,000 men. I think about 1,600 men of them are killed, but inflicts 6,000 killed, and almost 10,000 wounded, and about 20,000 prisoners on the Allied side, capturing 50 banners and more than 180 guns. The Russians bore the lion's share of these losses. In fact, entire regiments are devastated. And of course, anytime you will be in Paris, you can go to the Place de Vendôme and see the wonderful column of Vendôme, which is made from those dozens and dozens of Russian cannons that were smelted and turned into the one of the most striking symbols of the French imperial glory. And it is this realization just how inadequate the coalition force proved to be when matched with the Grande Armée, that forces the Russians and the Austrians to start regrouping, start reorganizing, start reforming their army. So immediate response, kind of legacy of Austerlitz, is actually something that French will come to woo and regret, because after Austerlitz, Russians begin to pay attention to the changes that the French made in their military force, learn from those changes, cherry-pick, adopt those changes, and effectively improve their war capacity, their military capacity, to the degree that the army that Napoleon is facing in 1813 is inherently different from the army that he faced on those snow-covered fields of Austerlitz. It is after the Austerlitz that Russians will reorganize their artillery. It is after long actually studying realization what gave the French greater operational maneuverability, that they will borrow the corps system, and so on and so on. Now, if we get to the higher level of it, right, more on a nation level, then the thrashing that the Allies received at Austerlitz is one of the classical study of a single battle, quote unquote, right? A decisive battle that ends the war and gives you the triumph. Austerlitz breaks Russian and Austrian determination to fight. Yes, Russians refuse to sign an armistice, or peace. They sign the armistice, but not peace. Yes, they kind of retreat back, licking, and it will take them a while to get back. But Austrians' determination is certainly crushed. And there's only just a few days, not even weeks or months, just a few days of Austerlitz that the Austrian signing an armistice that will lead to the Peace of Pressburg. And it is a treaty that underscores the remarkable growth in the French power. The Habsburgs are forced to pay a huge indemnity to France. They're giving up all of Venice and Tyrol. They effectively surrender, and this is probably the most important outcome of Austerlitz, is that after Austerlitz, the Habsburgs are surrendering their influence in Central Europe. Right? It is Austerlitz that delivers the death blow to the Holy Roman Empire, which drew its last breath just a few months later in 1806. You will no longer have a polity that dominated the Central European reality for a better part of millennia. Instead of that, now you'll have a new reality emerging, the Confederation of the Rhine, where the German states, German principalities, are accepting French dominion. And with that dominion comes French-style occupation, change, and shall we say, beginning of modernity because of the transformations that Napoleon will bring in Germany?
a sense that the order of the world changes over the course of a 15-minute walk up the Pratzen heights. Um, sort of. But one final question, the question that everybody's been screaming from the moment we started the Eve of Austerlitz episode. 2 and a bit hours later, Alex, Austerlitz, is it Napoleon's greatest victory?
It is. I think my answer will be quite emphatic on this, because he understood the enemy that he was facing, and that takes a tremendous amount of perception, I think mental acuity and ability to exploit it. I've said many times that the Allies did everything to help Napoleon. In fact, it's not just my view of it. In fact, contemporaries were absolutely furious at what happened in Austerlitz. And it brings to my mind, for example, Russian diplomat, a very distinguished diplomat who spent all of his career in London, Semyon Vorontsov, father of a future distinguished Russian officer, Mikhail Vorontsov. And Vorontsov, when he reads his son's letters and then hears the reports from different kind of sources, he writes this private letter in which he says, "We did everything," this is a quote, "we did everything we could to lose the battle." And I think Vorontsov, if you read the rest of his letter, and especially letters like that written by others, is that they are all bemoaning the fact that that Russians are falling behind, right? That they need to improve. But that realization that the Russian army was kind of falling behind and not where it needs to be in order to compete with the new style, quote unquote, new style of operational warfare that Napoleon is practicing, is something that Napoleon understood early on. And so I do believe that Austerlitz is his greatest victory. In fact, Joseph de Maistre, right, one of the founding fathers of conservatism, right? For Joseph de Maistre, Austerlitz was, and this is a quote from him, some kind of magic, even witchcraft. And he says, "I cannot find words to describe it." And that, I think, goes to the heart of the remarkable battle that we've spent, as you said, 2 hours exploring.
If ever people want to debate the greatest commander of the Napoleonic era, then I would urge them to listen to this double bill, because it indicates how Napoleon truly does stand head and shoulders above almost any commander across military history, period, far less than the Napoleonic era. I know the Wellington fan club does like to turn around and say, "Oh yes, but Waterloo is a poor point of comparison. Waterloo pales by comparison to the capacity that is required to make Austerlitz work." And yes, for sure, Napoleon is helped by incompetence and misplaced machismo, quite frankly, on the Russian and Austrian side. But where is Wellington's Austerlitz? It's nowhere to be seen. There is no other battle during this period that stands on a par with Austerlitz. Alex, it's been a joy to run through this over the course of 2 episodes. Thank you so much for your time, for your passion, for your enthusiasm. Folks, if you haven't already, The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History is available from Oxford University Press, where you'll also find Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace. And as ever, we will put the link in the description so you can find your way to those very easily. And if you want more of Alex in your life, not only can you scroll back across the back catalogue of this show, but you can also hear him almost weekly, I think it is, or certainly every 10 days, based on the current release schedule, on the Napoleonic Quarterly. Alex, thank you so much for your time. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's been a privilege.
Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. Don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording, in late August 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Ner Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, Simon Weathers, John C., and Rosa. The Admirals, Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, and Rob Painter. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin. The Marshals, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, and Brian Sillicott. The Legion of Scholars, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Louis, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.